So last week, we looked at augmented sixth chords. If you didn't watch that video, maybe go do that first, because it will help with understanding some of what I'm going to talk about today. As a super short summary, an augmented sixth chord is a chord that sounds like a dominant seventh chord, but it functions as a predominant chord that resolves to the 5 chord. So in the key of C, that would be an A flat 7 going to a G, and then the G would resolve to the 1 chord, C major. It's called an augmented sixth chord because of the way one of the intervals in it is spelled on paper, and because of how it resolves when it goes to the 5 chord. I talked about all that last week, and it's not really relevant to what we're going to look at today. At the end of last week's video, I shared my observation that an augmented sixth chord moving to the 5 chord sounds pretty resolved. The 5 chord is supposed to be a tense harmony that strongly pulls your ear to want to resolve to the 1 chord. So how can the 5 chord sound so resolved if an augmented sixth chord comes right before it? It has to do with a musical device called tritone substitution. If you're somebody who gets all your music education from perusing the internet, you've probably at least come across this term before. I made a video on it in my early days of music theory videos. I think it was like my second video ever. So I'm going to talk about it again today, but in a different context. We're going to look at how it works on a fundamental level and explore some of the possibilities it opens up. First thing first, we need to understand what a tritone is. A tritone is a musical interval of 6 semitones, or 3 whole tones, hence the name tritone. You might also hear it called a diminished fifth, flat fifth, augmented fourth, sharp fourth. These all refer to the same acoustic interval, but what you would call it in a given scenario depends on the context. Tritone is the all-encompassing name for it. It's a unique interval in that it's symmetrical within an octave. An octave is 12 semitones, so a tritone, being 6 semitones, is half an octave. Because of this, if you invert it or transpose one of its notes by an octave, you still get a tritone. It will look a little different on paper, like if you spelled it out as a diminished fifth, it will be spelled as an augmented fourth once inverted, but that's still a tritone. So inverting it won't produce a different interval. The inversion of a tritone is still a tritone. And because of this, without the right context, you can't perceive either one of the notes as carrying more importance than the other. Compare this to, say, a major third. If I played you this, and I asked you which note you hear as the root, you would almost certainly say the A. With just this much context, you're almost certainly going to hear it as an A major chord without its fifth. Yeah, you could hear it as other things, like maybe the A is the third of the chord, and we're not hearing the root. If A was the third, the root would probably be F sharp, making it an F sharp minor chord. But with no context, if you just heard A and C sharp sounding together, your ear is going to hear A major. There's no two ways about it. But a tritone? You can't tell what's a root, third, whatever, not without more context. This unique property of the tritone opens up a ton of musical possibilities. Let's think about my opening example of A flat 7 to G to C major. Let's just pretend the G chord is G7. If we're in the key of C, and we were to expand the G chord to a 7th chord, it would be G7. Really, G and G7 are interchangeable. In this case, they both act as the 5 chord. A dominant 7th chord, such as G7, contains a tritone. It's between the 3rd and 7th of the chord. The tritone is a dissonant interval. It's one of the main reasons the 5 chord is pulling your ear to the 1 chord. In the most vanilla approach, the two notes in the tritone each step towards each other by a semitone, becoming the root and third of C major, the 1 chord. I feel like I talk about this exact thing every week, so sorry, regular viewers. The tritone resolving this way is a huge component driving the resolution of the G7 as a whole. But consider this, the tritone is symmetrical. It resolves when its two notes move in opposite directions by semitones. If I voiced the G7 in a way where the B was above the F, they would step away from each other. In doing so, they would bring us to a different voicing of C major. So because the tritone can step in or out by semitones, what happens if you only take the tritone itself into consideration and ignore what the rest of the dominant seventh chord is telling you? Like in this voicing, we expect them to step outward, but let's just make them go inward instead. That still sounds resolved, which of course it does. It's a dissonance resolving to a consonance. But when it brings the rest of the chord with it, it sounds like a sharp left turn or something. The dissonance has resolved, so the whole chord sounds resolved, but we're at an unexpected place. I've ended up at F sharp major. F sharp major is a tritone away from C major. Which makes sense. If I resolve my tritone in the opposite direction, my new destination will be a tritone away from the expected destination. F sharp major also happens to be a semitone below G. That is how tritone substitution works. You essentially reverse the roles of the notes that form the tritone. In any dominant seventh chord, we expect the third to resolve up and the seventh to resolve down. So if we make them do the opposite, we're resolving the third as if it's the seventh, and the seventh as if it's the third. And we end up a tritone away from where the ears expect. This principle is more or less how an augmented sixth chord operates. Our ears would expect A flat 7 to go to D flat major. But if we reverse the roles of the tritone in the A flat 7, we end up a tritone away from D flat, which is G major, the 5 chord in the key of C. And because the tritone is resolving, the 5 chord sounds kinda resolved. Any chord that has a tritone in it can be tritone subbed. This includes dominant seventh chords with whatever alterations, all manner of diminished chords, minor sixth chords. All of those have an expected resolution baked into them. If you tritone sub the resolution, you're subverting that expectation in such a way that you still achieve a resolution, because the tritone still resolves either way. This is a musical device that should be used wisely. Because there are expectations in the harmonies we generally use, you have to do a certain amount of meeting expectations before you can subvert them. Otherwise, the effect is either lost or it becomes stale and predictable. So explore this. I could go down and show you every possible tritone substitution trick, but that would be really boring for both of us. And I think you'll get more value out of taking this idea and exploring what's possible on your own. Final order of business, I have a couple openings for new private Zoom students right now. Private lessons are primarily how I make a living and are what allow me to continue making videos such as this, so if that's something you might be interested in, feel free to reach out to me directly on whatever platform you're viewing this on, or you can go here and fill out the contact form. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.